Nothing's certain in politics, but professionals know one thing. Subscribing to the Cook Politico Report is the right decision in every election cycle.
For more than 4 decades, the Cook Politico Report has been providing political professionals with the right analysis to help them invest political capital with confidence.
A deep knowledge of the past, combined with a meticulous, unbiased analysis of the present, produces the most accurate predictions of the future, time and time again.
Because it's all backed by data from every input that decides elections for president, Congress, and governorships.
Subscribers to the Cook Political Report get the clarity they need through smart analysis that you won't get anywhere else.
Like the very latest outlook for every race and access to our analysts. Amy Walter, David Wasserman, Carrie Dan, Jessica Taylor, Aaron Covey, and Matthew Klein.
The Cook Politico Report offers
the right analysis,
the right analysis,
the right analysis,
the right analysis
for getting it right. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Hello, welcome to the Odd Years. I'm Amy Walter. It's a consequential week in the Supreme Court as justices hear a case that could reorient the bounds of executive authority and overturn a 90-year precedent that insulates independent government agencies from political interference from the president. Now, President Trump has tested the bounds of his executive power on everything from tariffs and trade to immigration to government spending. It's now up to the Supreme Court to determine just how far that authority can stretch, which is why I wanted to talk to my guest today, Josh Gerstein, a reporter at Politico who covers the intersection of law and politics, which these days feels like just about everything under the sun. We talked about the dynamics in this Supreme Court, how they may rule on these upcoming cases, as well as ones like the Voting Rights Act. Now, we recorded this conversation on Thursday, December 4th, right before the court announced they were taking up the birthright citizenship case and before they issued their stay on Texas's redistricting map. But you know what? We cover so much else that it is absolutely worth a listen. You don't want to miss it. Here we go. Hey, Josh, thanks so much for joining me today.
Hey, Amy, great to chat with you again. You doing well?
I am. You are busy, as always. I love that you cover the intersection of law and politics, which basically says to me, you have to cover everything that goes on in Washington.
These days, I feel like if I was older and I was around in the 50s, it wouldn't have been like this. But it does feel like this legal Leviathan has sort of gobbled up more and more of this city. So I do find that many things that might not have been on the legal plate 20 or 30 years ago are definitely on the legal plate at the moment.
That is exactly what I wanted to talk to you about, though a little more specifically about the Supreme Court's role. Obviously, as you well know, the role of the Department of Justice, the role of lower courts, all of the things have become even more part of Washington and of our politics. But as I said, I wanted to focus this conversation more specifically on the Supreme Court. You have covered it for years. You understand it like few others do. I want to talk about the dynamics that go on in there, specifically about the dynamics between the justices, the impact the court could have not just on this president, but future presidents and their abilities to do certain things or not do certain things. And then the cases that are still to be decided that you think could have a real impact on these next couple of years in our politics and our elections. So let's start with the big picture. Judge, is it fair to say that this Supreme Court is going to determine the real bounds of executive authority for the foreseeable future for the President of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think they've done some of that. They've been sticking their toe into the water here for a while. But even with respect to President Trump, they kind of got a head start with that last year before he won the election, particularly with their immunity decision that basically functionally shut down at least one of the criminal cases that he was facing and sort of complicated the efforts to prosecute any former president, which I do think goes to executive authority, because his arguments there were that a president would have to be unduly cautious if he stood in fear of his successor prosecuting him
Right.
for something. And so we kind of got off to the races with that. And the court came out, I think, in that case, very much in Trump's corner. They would say very much in the corner of presidential prerogatives and power. They wouldn't say Trump's corner, but as a practical matter, that was what was up right then. It wasn't 100%, and there were some compromises on the side of the Republican appointees and the majority, and some sort of mealy-mouthed language that they used in that opinion. But they definitely came out on Trump's side. And then obviously Trump actually did win this most recent election, and we've seen a series of disputes come to the court since then, most of them on an emergency basis that basically involve, I wouldn't say every policy initiative that the White House has attempted since Trump came in for his second term, but most of them ranging from spending and not spending of government money, ranging from removing top officials of government agencies, the president's ability to fire people. Obviously, a big subject in this Trump administration, as in the previous one, immigration and powers of immigration enforcement to push the envelope there. So we've just seen a whole number of different disputes come to the court, often on an emergency basis, because the court's agenda for its the term that ended this summer was already set before Trump came in. And so now we're seeing some of those things come back to the court on a little bit of a slower timeline. But it did feel like a frenzy for the first 6 or 7 months, where every Friday afternoon we were getting a flurry of orders from the Supreme Court, and they were giving the thumbs up or thumbs down on basically various Trump policies. Felt like the whole administration was enmeshed in litigation.
Yeah. So can we kind of put some order to this? Because you're right. It does feel as if, first of all, trying to understand the difference between this so-called shadow docket or emergency rulings versus what we think of when we think of the Supreme Court, of people coming in and you have the hearings, and then in the summer they release those opinions. Where are we now on so many of those things you just discussed about being able to fire who you want to fire? We have tariffs, right? Does he have the power to do this?
Right.
Taking rescissions, taking money away from programs that had already been congressionally approved. Where do those all sit?
So, I mean, trying to give the big, broad picture, I would say that on most of those things, the court has sided with Trump and sided with him pretty strongly, but it's not totally uniform. The one caveat that I think you have to lay out before you talk about how is he doing on all these emergency things that went to the court is, by and large, with I think one or two exceptions, the things that went to the Supreme Court weren't there at the request of the Justice Department, which means the Trump administration decided to take those things to the court. So that skews the numbers very dramatically. It's like some kind of a sports tournament where you get to choose which other teams you're going to play. Of course you're going to do well, unless you're really bad at picking. And John Sauer, who is the Solicitor General, is not really bad at picking. And so they have been strategic, and they've taken issues to the Supreme Court where they are fairly confident they will be successful. So that I give that just as a caveat at the top, that the numbers might not reflect if you randomly selected Trump policies and had the Supreme Court rule on them, because that is not what has happened. But I would say, if you go through the different areas, the removal of executive officials that Trump wanted to get rid of, he has been almost completely successful, at least on a short-term basis, on getting people out that he wants to get out. The court is has taken a few cases to try to sort out some issues of whether he can get rid of everybody. The justices seem to be uncomfortable with him firing a member of the Federal Reserve Board. That seemed to go too far. It's unclear whether that's for legal reason that it went too far, or people are nervous that if Trump starts, unpackaging the Federal Reserve Board, we'll have an economic crisis or a stock market meltdown. But it does seem like other than the Fed, maybe somebody at the Library of Congress, the Supreme Court is more than willing to let Trump replace all of these people. It's not, I don't think, Amy, a very surprising result because this is a direction the court was headed in long before Trump came into office. And it fits into this theory of the unitary executive that the president should basically have very broad power, certainly over the officials at the top of that chain. Maybe we'll talk later about people down at the bottom of that chain who were a lot of the numbers of federal employees that were getting fired and laid off earlier this year. But even there, the Supreme Court so far has given Trump pretty broad leeway. In other areas, trade is still outstanding. The tariffs case, I think, is going to be a big test. I think he might lose that case because it's a pretty big ask. And it also actually divides the conservative political establishment. Of course, the Supreme Court blinds themselves to those things, but they know full well that the Wall Street Journal editorial page is very hostile to Trump's tariffs policies. And if you take sort of the extreme liberal view and believe we have justices that are in the pocket of billionaires, those billionaires almost uniformly are against the tariffs. So it's not like a very clean break on a political basis. And so I think that lingers in the background and might have something to do with the way that dispute comes out. But we'll see what happens. On immigration, Trump has gotten to do what he wanted to do on enforcement, with one caveat, which is we had this showdown earlier this year over his use of the Alien Enemies Act to deport what he said were gang members, although these people had not gone through any kind of court process to be determined to be a gang member, that he just decided in the course of a week he was going to ship them out, move them all to some prison in Texas and ship them to even more secure and notorious prison in El Salvador. One round of that happened sort of before the issue reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has kind of frozen it since then. So that's one area where he has not totally gotten his way on more mundane and routine, but I'm sure scary to some of the people involved. Immigration enforcement, it's sort of a split decision. We've seen in LA, they had a case where the court allowed them to continue with stops based on pretty thin pretext, like somebody who may look Hispanic or speak Spanish and be standing in a Home Depot parking lot. That might be enough, it appears, to allow the Border Patrol to at least question them at some point. But, so far, some of the National Guard call-outs that he's attempted to deal with either immigration or protesters against his immigration policy have been kind of held up by the court. So those are a few of the areas. We can do some more, but that's sort of, it's a bit of a mixed bag. But look, it's also a 6-3 court, Amy, where
That's what I wanted to, exactly.
yeah, it's not just a 6-3 court. It's a third of the justices are Trump appointees. They don't uniformly vote for him. But again, if you're playing the odds and you don't know anything else about a case and you know that it's a 6-3 court, 6 conservatives and 3 liberals, again, if you don't know anything else, you would roll the dice. You bet on the Trump side winning in most of the cases.
But Josh, that hasn't always been the case, right? That even if a court had a majority that had been appointed by a Democrat or a Republican, it didn't always hold true that those justices would vote in favor of a president who shared their party.
Yeah, and it still doesn't always hold true. Amy Coney Barrett basically dissented from part of the immunity ruling on Trump's criminal prosecution, although it doesn't get a lot of attention. She basically said she disagreed with part of it, that she decided to label it as a concurrence, but she said she disagreed. And we've seen other areas where, his justices have taken positions that I don't think he would agree with. Neil Gorsuch, the first Trump appointee to the Supreme Court, wrote the court's opinion that discovered that LGBT rights were already contained in federal law and had been for decades protected by federal law, which is a position I think almost no one in the Trump administration would have advocated for. Yet Gorsuch wrote that opinion, I believe, with Roberts going along and the court's liberals. So you do see that from time to time. I think you see it less in part because, as you well know, Amy, the confirmation fights have become so contentious, and the past is a lesson here. And some, especially on the conservative side, but also on the liberal side, have learned lessons saying, look, we can't afford defections anymore. And
there won't be David Souter anymore.
Right. We don't have David Souter or even Sandra Day O'Connor's anymore, where they're going to, in mid-career begin to moderate. We even see that criticism of Chief Justice John Roberts, right? Who was supposed to be a very stout conservative when he was put on the court. And lo and behold, when we get to the Dobbs ruling a few years ago, he says he would rather go slow on the abortion issue. Why can't we be incremental about this? And the rest of the conservatives on the court run headlong.
Yeah, and on Obamacare, right?
Correct, and on Obamacare. So, and what that results in is not just criticism of that justice, but the next opening that comes up, the legal advocates tend to be, and the people that are trying to sort of position and steer the courts tend to be even more adamant, whether it's Leonard Leo or in past generation Nan Aaron on the left and Leonard Leo on the right. They will say, well, we need someone that will pass virtually all of our ideological tests. They often manage to do that without asking the person directly, but they can find enough people in their life who will tell you, I will absolutely guarantee this person will vote to overturn Roe versus Wade if given the chance or whatever. And if they get enough assurances like that, they take it. But it does seem like the stakes get up higher and higher, and the votes on those nominations get more and more narrow. And it's very rare to find now any members of the opposing party who are willing to vote. Heck, forget Supreme Court nominees, even for the circuit court nominees and the district court nominees, they're almost all going on a party line vote or something close to that. And in a lot of cases, they're not even getting to vote, depending on the situation. We have complete standoff in a lot of places, judges, U.S. attorneys, and so forth, because the president and the senators from those states cannot sufficiently see eye to eye about who to appoint. So that there's no question the partisan warfare over the legal and judicial stuff has become much more intense just in the last decade or two since I've been really focused on it.
Well, that brings us to the U.S. attorney case. You had Alina Habba, who was appointed by President Trump to be the acting U.S. attorney in New Jersey. And just this week, she was disqualified from continuing by a federal appeals court. It kind of goes to your point, which is you have these U.S. attorneys. I think there are over 90 of them. Very few of those U.S. attorneys are actually in place who are not in an acting capacity, and many are still waiting for confirmation. So what does this do to our legal process, Josh, that you have, as you said, judges still waiting for their Senate confirmation? We only have a handful, it seems, of permanent U.S. attorneys that are in their jobs. How does our legal system work?
Well, in the judge's situation, you end up primarily with backlogs that increase. It already takes usually a few years for civil cases to be handled, and maybe two in the criminal system, 2 years for a criminal case to just get through the first stage. In certain parts of the country, depending on the judicial workload, you have the courts will declare emergencies saying, like, we have so many seats open, we've got not just like 500 cases per judge, which if you think about it means, on every working day, sort of 2.5 cases for every working day out of the year.
That just seems right. That's impossible.
Right. And then it just starts to stack up, and then they start to prioritize. Well, you think about some of the cases, antitrust case sometimes takes a couple years, and the trial might take 6 weeks. And it's not 6 weeks of like, I saw this guy, on the corner with a gun. It's 6 weeks of just droning,
mind-numbing
technical testimony from computer engineers, because most of these antitrust cases now seem to be about tech stuff going on. And we've had cases in D.C. and elsewhere where the judge is tied up with that functionally for like a year and a half. So that gets worse. On the U.S. attorney's side, I would say it's a little more concerning because those offices can operate on autopilot fairly well. It's not really supposed to be a policy-making position. It's not like saying...
Yeah, it's a political appointment.
It's a political appointment, but it's a prosecutor's office, and they do set priorities. But by and large, the priorities are honestly set by the Justice Department, not by the local U.S. attorney. They have some autonomy, but it's like in practice, DOJ will tell them, we want you to focus on this, and they'll do it. The problem is with the U.S. attorney's offices, what we've seen is I think it's much easier to achieve, if you're looking to achieve a political objective through prosecution, much easier to do that with someone that you appointed, say, 48 hours earlier, or conceivably appointed knowing that you wanted a specific case pursued, which is what we saw.
Are you talking about James Comey?
Yeah, well, James Comey, Letitia James' case in Alexandria. We also have the case that Haba's pursuing against Congresswoman McIver up in New Jersey about the standoff or the showdown, if you will, at the Immigration Detention Center in Newark. And then we have these unusual selections for U.S. attorney of Trump selecting people that were part of his personal legal team, like Haba, like Lindsay Halligan in Alexandria, Virginia, where, they don't seem to hold a lot of the traditional qualifications, someone that was in that office or has worked for 10 years.
Right, has really strong prosecutor.
Right, I'd worked for 10 years in, say, a state or
Yeah.
county prosecutor's office if they hadn't served as an assistant U.S. attorney. I'm just estimating there are probably 10,000 people in this country, maybe more, who have worked as assistant U.S. attorneys. And so it's not like there's no pool to select from. And so I think it does raise eyebrows, just the fact that you're selecting someone who is part of your personal legal team. And then, frankly, these cases then get mired somewhat in disputes about whether they are political, which is a tough case to make in court, the selective and vindictive prosecution argument. But we're seeing it made, I think a lot of people would say, more credibly in these cases that have come up in the last few months because of the appointment issue and because of the president's unusual tendency to publicly instruct his prosecutors about people he would like them to go after, which is something I won't say has never happened in the history of the United States or the modern history. If you want to find examples, you could say, well, George H.W. Bush told DOJ after the first Rodney King verdict, they should look into whether there should be a federal case. And that happened, what are we talking about, 30 years ago or so, 25, 30 years ago. But it doesn't happen much. And certainly pointing at specific people and saying, I would like to see these 4 or 5 people prosecuted and you need to move now in capital letters is just not something we've seen in the modern era. And it leads to those cases getting, I think, a very hard look from the judge and the appointment of those U.S. attorneys getting a very hard look that they might not get in other circumstances.
Quick break, and we'll be back with Josh Gerstein. If you want to stay up to date on redistricting news, and I know you do, check out our new interactive redistricting map. It highlights the latest developments in redistricting efforts across the country, and best of all, it's free. That's right, free. It's in front of the paywall. Go to cookpolitical.com/redistricting to check it out. Josh, I want to go to the Supreme Court justices themselves and the dynamics there. And again, you are the expert on this. I do not spend time poring over the dissents of justices, but it seems to me that some of the liberals, Sotomayor, Ketanji Brown's dissents have been incredibly scathing, personally directed at their fellow jurists, the conservatives. Am I reading that correctly, or is this just sort of common practice and we're paying more attention to the Supreme Court now because of how many high-profile cases are there?
There have been times, I'm not a historian, but there have certainly been times when people regarded the Supreme Court as sort of a scorpion bowl, and there were people not in there that were not talking to each other or, for years on end and bearing heavy grudges and things like that. I don't think the justices are best buddies, and I don't think that any of them proclaim to be.
Right.
They sometimes tell these stories that I find rather vacuous about how they all get along well. And at the core of the stories, you get these sort of banal things like they shake hands before they go out and hear arguments.
Right.
And it's sort of like, well, that's...
I remembered his birthday.
Right. And
Yeah.
yes, and
nice.
Clarence Thomas, when my nephew has a birthday, he'll say something, or he knows the elevator operator's birthday or whatever. Interesting personal anecdotes about their warmth as a person. I think the Clarence Thomas documentary I saw is quite fascinating, but a little lacking. We're talking about whether they're actually debating these huge issues of state and the direction of the country and moral factors. I just don't totally buy that whether they take mints out of the same mint bowl the moment they go out is really a terribly relevant factor. And then when you start to press them, well, nobody presses them because they generally don't do interviews with people that are going to press them on this sort of thing. But when it comes up in passing in the interviews that they do, which are often with judges who are below them in the judicial food chain, they'll say things like, well, we don't hang out together that much, but I had a party for this justice when she came on the court or he came on the court, because that's like a tradition. And then they'll start to talk about Scalia and Ginsburg going to the opera.
The opera, right. It always comes back to that.
And, my reaction to that is, again, they're both dead.
Right. What does it tell you?
They haven't been
about?
going to the opera for a long, long time.
Yeah.
And these are historical examples. So could you just give me another one, and you'll get like, well, Scalia took Kagan hunting or whatever. And you're like, okay, yeah, like that's like 15 years ago or something. Like they don't really try to make the case that we're hanging out. Now, I'm not saying they need to hang out or whatever, but Justice Elena Kagan has made some sort of interesting comments about this subject and has sort of said it is important that they have like a working environment where they can be hospitable and exchange views. Roberts is fond of saying he's never heard a word said in anger at one of the private conferences that the court has. Although you would hope the bar would be a little more than that, and that's sort of what I've heard Kagan say a few times, which is that's sort of like a necessary condition for us to have a frank and candid effort to try to compromise on things, but it's not sufficient. And I don't see the illustrations that sort of indicate to me that they're robustly engaged with each other on all sorts of topics, and that on those really difficult cases, is there a real dialogue? I don't know. And on some of the things we talked about earlier, Amy, about the emergency docket,
That's right.
it's not clear to me on most of those matters that there's any dialogue. Like sometimes they release these decisions, there's no intervening conference of the court. Perhaps there's an email chain that people are on. It's also possible that people are just casting their votes like thumbs up and thumbs down. Sometimes there's a short opinion. Sometimes there isn't. The big immigration case in California, Kavanaugh wrote a detailed opinion because people have been criticizing the court for not explaining its actions in some of these emergency appeals, shadow docket appeals. He wrote a detailed opinion. A lot of people didn't like it, but I would give him credit for explaining what he was doing. The other 5 justices in the majority didn't join his opinion and didn't say anything. So all we know is that the lower court ruling that had put restrictions on how CBP Border Patrol could operate in the LA area, that was lifted. And we have Kavanaugh's explanation of why, and we have the liberals' explanation of why they would have left it in place and not disturbed it. And the majority of the court, the other 5 justices, are essentially sitting silently, which is their right, but then it becomes confusing, and we've seen this earlier this year as well, where you start to get district court judges complaining that it's hard for us to know exactly how we're supposed to handle the next
Right.
case if you just release sort of a vote, but you don't explain why.
Right. How is it precedent So to follow precedent on something that doesn't have a written order, right? Is that the issue?
Correct, right. And if there's no rationale for it, when the
Right.
next case comes up, we don't know, did you reject this because the other judge's order was too broad, or you didn't think the dispute was ripe, or you didn't think there was really irreparable injury? There's also the possibility that if you're just going by vote, there's the chance that the 5 justices who voted but didn't explain may have had 5 different reasons for why they lifted that judge's order in the immigration
Right.
litigation in California. And some of them will say, well, one reason we don't want to explain is the case will or may eventually come back to us. And if we've already laid down our views, it becomes sort of hard then for a justice to say, I know I said that this is, irreparable harm, or it's fine to stop someone based on the language they're speaking, but now I've changed my mind. It just doesn't happen very often. And so some of the justices have said, we don't explain because we feel it distorts when we get to the round you spoke about earlier, where we have actual arguments in the courtroom and
Yeah.
briefs and so forth. The fact that we've all staked out our positions makes it actually harder to compromise or harder to change one's mind. So that's their argument. But given the volume of emergency litigation that we're seeing, it has produced frustration not only among Democratic appointed justices, but Republican appointed justices. In fact, one who got smacked down by the Supreme Court for not following its order happened to be a Reagan appointed a judge up in Boston, who got whacked by Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh in an opinion for sort of being insolent towards the Supreme Court, which is kind of funny because, he's a Reagan appointee and he was like so contrite after the court did that. It seemed like his feelings had been like deeply hurt.
Josh, I want to get to cases that may come out either. Well, we don't have much time left in this year, but let's talk about that could come out in 2026. Usually, at least in the time that I've been in Washington, very few of these Supreme Court cases have the ability to have an immediate political impact, especially on an election. The Dobbs decision was a big exception to that when that
Right.
came out in 2022. Obviously had a massive impact on the midterms. Is there some case that you're watching that is working its way through that is likely to come down in 2026 that you think could have an immediate political impact?
Well, it kind of depends how quickly something were to come out. I mean, there is a case pending that is on sort of the interaction between the Voting Rights
That's
Act
right.
and voting rights and constitutional voting rights that has to do with race and voting and gerrymandering that the Supreme Court has heard. So in theory, it could be decided at any time. It's called Louisiana versus Calais.
That's right.
I say they've heard it. It's kind of funny, Amy. They've actually heard it twice. They heard it last term, and they didn't feel like it really got into one issue that they wanted to explore. And so then they asked to hear it again. So you would think maybe they might decide it. I don't know. It maybe doesn't quite meet your criteria because my gut.
No, it does, because it has the impact. It could have an impact, maybe not immediately on 2026, because to your point, if it doesn't,
Correct. Oh, it will have
an impact.
I think it will have a major, however that comes out, will have a major political impact. I am a little dubious that it will impact 2026 because I
Yes.
think if the court wanted to reset the rules for 2026, they would do it now. Like they would have done it a couple weeks ago because we already have a fight going on over the Texas redistricting at the moment. Their filing deadline is December 8th. So if the court's going to issue decisions that are going to cause states to rip up their maps, time is getting very, very nigh. And I just don't think that a court led by John Roberts would unleash something like that at this stage. In the process. But that said, the ruling, I think in the longer term after 2026 could be very very, very significant. It has to do with sort of how and when a state is allowed to take account of race in
That's
drawing district lines. And, some states, in this case Louisiana, said, well, we drew these lines because we knew that the Voting Rights Act says we're supposed to be very careful not to dilute the voting power of minorities. So, often as a result of litigation or threatened litigation or a settlement from litigation, the state will say, okay, well, we'll have 2 districts that are majority minority, usually majority Black, sometimes Latino, occasionally it's multiple minorities, but so they'll do that. And the question is doing that take so much account of racial identity that it in and of itself may be unconstitutional. And so that's the issue that the court sort of pulled into this case, and that they heard arguments on fairly recently. And so they're going to have to sort of decide what this intersection is, because the Voting Rights Act really does tell states, in certain situations that they do need to take account of race. And yet you have John Roberts and, view of the Constitution saying that we should almost never take account of race. And he's got the famous line, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. But what it means in this very specific practical context of line drawing is unclear. It's unclear, I think, with the court as a whole. Some justices, it's more clear. Some seem to certainly be fine with it, and some are very, very hostile to it. Like Clarence Thomas seems very, very hostile, and I think he might well be willing to strike down the entire Voting Rights Act.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you, Josh, because there were, if you listen to some of the folks, again, the more partisan voices after they heard those arguments, would argue that it's the likelihood of the Voting Rights Act being overturned was very high, and that this was going to do more than just go around the edges, but that essentially it would give license to the states to basically redraw the lines without taking race into consideration at all. And that it seems to be the expectation from partisans about what they expect to see. Are you in that same camp?
I think I'm not quite in that camp. I feel like there has been I don't want to call it a moderation, because it's still a court that's pretty hostile to voting rights enforcement, as we traditionally understood it, where you have civil rights groups suing to try to force states to redraw lines to make it more likely that Black or Hispanic candidates will have a chance to win the elections. This is seen as one of John Roberts' signature issues when he came onto the court in 2003. He, about a decade later, issued this, Shelby County decision that did away with a process that had been in place in most of the southern states and some parts of northern states that required them to clear all of their voting-related changes, including voter ID laws and district lines. Conservatives would point out, even to move a polling place, you had to send a letter to the Justice Department and get them to say yes, or you could go to court and do it that way. He wrote that decision that basically knocked out that entire chunk of the Voting Rights Act, which was a very important piece. I mean, it had a bureaucracy at the Justice Department and in every one of these states devoted to just dealing with these issues, which was called pre-clearance. It's pretty nerdy sounding, but there were a lot of people that litigated those kinds of issues, and they just essentially knocked that whole thing out. Roberts still has, I think, pretty strong views on race that we see through the affirmative action decision, striking down college affirmative action. But I felt like the foot has come a little bit off the accelerator in the last couple of years. There's still been decisions cutting back little by little on the Voting Rights Act. But, there have been a couple times where the court has just sort of let maps go through, as they did in an earlier iteration of this Louisiana case, where they could have stepped in and stopped it. And so I don't know. Is that part of some broader moderation on the court? Maybe it doesn't matter what Roberts thinks because we have a 6-justice conservative majority, only need 5 votes. But it always matters a little bit what the Chief Justice thinks. And some of the other conservatives, I just don't know as much that they're like, does Amy Coney Barrett have really strong views on these voting rights issues? I don't know. It's not really an issue she has been identified with. It's not really an issue that she had a lot of, as far as I know, any scholarship on when she came to the court. And so, we know that Clarence Thomas wants to step on the gas. We know that Alito wants to step on the gas in terms of pushing back what they view as like liberal intrusions and the liberal racialization of voting. We know that. But the other justices in the middle, their views are a little more murky. And so I think once again, we might see a kind of iterative decision that pushes back some of the VRA requirements some more, but doesn't actually completely neuter them. So I can't tell you exactly how that will be written because it wasn't really clear at the arguments to me that there was like a consensus on exactly how to word something like this. So that's another reason also, frankly, to think we might not see the opinion before Christmas time because it could well be one of those that goes down, to next June. And frankly, I think when they put the case over for re-argument into this term, that was a signal that they weren't really going to resolve this in the 2026, in time for it to matter to the 2026 cycle.
That sounds very good. All right, the one last case I'm going to ask you about that could have a big impact even in 2026, but again, certainly into the next election cycle, is the Republican Senate committee versus the FEC. And this is a campaign coordination case, fundraising case, essentially, which, Josh, tell me if I'm wrong in putting it in layman's terms this way, but essentially, right now, the campaign committees can only give a certain amount of money to candidates. There are restrictions and rules around that. This case could determine whether the campaign committees now can coordinate without any of those rules in place. And so the money from the campaign committees goes straight to the candidates. There, again, are many that I talk to in sort of political and partisan circles who are expecting this coordination rule to be overturned. The case is expected to be heard in early December. Tell us, first of all, how likely it is you think that there is some already pretty clear indications about what the court would like to do, even though we haven't heard the case yet. And second, what impact you think this could have? What are the arguments for and against it?
So I think, again, it's hard to know on a justice by justice basis what they would think about this specific issue. But in terms of the general trend lines at the court, we've seen over the last couple decades an increasing hostility towards campaign finance regulation generally. And so this is actually asking the court to revisit an issue that it squarely addressed 25 years ago. So I guess you could call it overturning precedent. And that might well be one of the issues that gets into the mix here. I'm sure the liberal justices will say, this is just a statute that we're talking about on coordinated expenditures. And, Congress is free to adjust it in some way if they want. But, I just think that eventually, over time, we've seen the court move away from campaign finance regulation, think that it's more and more dubious on a First Amendment basis. I do also think that the justices are influenced by arguments that they hear in the political sphere. And as you well know, Amy, there is I think now a fairly widely held view, probably among people who are sort of operatives in both sides of both Democratic and Republican politics, that some of the things that have been done vis-a-vis campaign finance regulation have diminished the political parties in a way that is unhealthy for our political system. By unhealthy, what they usually mean is have encouraged super PACs to spend money, sometimes from one individual or a few wealthy individuals, in some kind of weird parallel structure to political campaigns. And that in some ways, some have argued, even more prone to corruption than having money flow directly through the parties, because it's sort of opaque what's going on behind closed doors. And that these sort of coordination limits are just another thing that makes life harder for the political parties that are already having a hard time in the current environment. I don't think that's an argument you can just sort of stand at the podium in the Supreme Court courtroom and make, because it's not a strictly legal argument, but it is out there in the ether. And so I wouldn't be surprised that justices would be skeptical, at least on the conservative side, that these sorts of limits are very useful, or it is an intrusion on what the court has decided is a speech-related issue of being able to donate to candidates. So, I think it's difficult if they're going to view it that way as an intrusion on free speech rights. The government has to sort of come forward with a very strong argument about why this is necessary, and I think that's an area where the justices are going to be skeptical. And so I would think there's a good chance that this will be overturned. And if it isn't, I think the reason it wouldn't be is just because it's such a recent decision, relatively recent, 25 years ago from the Supreme Court, that they might be a little bit uncomfortable reversing a precedent that quickly. But, the fact they're hearing it means that 4 justices voted to hear it. And so that's a pretty good indication that there are probably 4 justices willing to take this step, and they only really need one more to sort of join their camp in order to carry the day.
Right. And for you political nerds that are listening in, I think one of the key elements here, if this does get overturned, is the fact that these campaign committees now can the reason this matters is that in at least the last couple of cycles, Democrats have done a much better job raising small dollars, raising individual dollars, the campaigns themselves, and the campaign committees have to go and put up ads using their independent expenditure. That's much more expensive than what the rate a candidate can get, right? When you go buy campaign ads, the rules say that a candidate gets the lowest unit rate, and outside groups have to pay basically the sticker price. It's going in to a car dealership, and one gets the sticker price and one gets
Right.
the dealer's choice. And if this ultimately is overturned, that advantage that Democrats have right now would go away, and that the campaign committees now can get that same lowest unit rate, put that money into those campaigns, and it's going to be. I know that both campaign committees are very focused on what the world would look like without this, but if it does come down this summer, I guess there is still plenty of time for the campaigns in 2026 to take advantage of it.
Yeah, and the other thing in this case that's interesting, Amy, is that usually the Justice Department defends. This is federal law, right? It's been federal law for some time. Usually the Justice Department defends it. In this particular case, the Trump Justice Department is not defending the statute,
Yeah.
so the court has had to bring in somebody else to defend the statute, and the Democratic committees are defending the statute. And so it's something we see from time to time now in administrations of both parties, that there are some laws they're sort of so hostile to that they say they can't, in good conscience, defend them. And this is one where the Trump administration has done that.
Yeah. And for understandable purposes, when it comes to, again, having the kinds of resources available to fund very important House and Senate races in the upcoming election. Josh, you've given us so much of your time. I really appreciate it, especially since every one of your hours is filled with tracking down all kinds of legal and other political cases. So I appreciate you giving us so much time.
No problem, Amy. It's been a great chat. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Odd Years. If you liked what you heard or want to make a suggestion, leave us a review or recommend us to a friend. You're our best way to get the word out about what we do. And if you want more from the Cook Political Report, consider becoming a subscriber. Go to cookpolitical.com/subscribe. Listeners can use the discount code ODD10, that's ODD, the number 10, to save 10% on any subscription. This offer is available only to new subscribers. The Odd Years is brought to you by the Cook Political Report and is produced by Becca Kaufman.